Hashtag a veteran watched a cop hurt his service dog. His two-word response left everyone in shock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's General Store as Marcus Thompson adjusted his prosthetic leg and reached for the door handle of his truck. Beside him, a golden retriever named Ranger sat perfectly still, his brown eyes alert and focused on his handler's every movement. The dog wore a bright blue vest with "Service Dog, Do Not Pet" emblazoned across both sides, along with various patches indicating his specialized training. Marcus had been coming to this same store every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. It was part of his routine, something his therapist had encouraged him to maintain after his return from Afghanistan. The familiar faces, the predictable layout of the aisles, and the gentle hum of everyday life helped quiet the storm that sometimes raged in his mind. Ranger had been his constant companion through it all, trained to detect the early signs of Marcus's panic attacks and provide deep pressure therapy when the memories became too vivid. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and Marcus felt the cool air conditioning brush against his face. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly store clerk, looked up from her magazine and smiled warmly. She had learned long ago not to call out to Ranger or try to pet him while he was working, understanding the importance of his role in Marcus's daily life. The veteran nodded respectfully in her direction before making his way toward the coffee aisle. As Marcus carefully selected his usual brand of coffee, Ranger remained in a perfect heel position, occasionally glancing up at his handler to check for any signs of distress. The dog had been with Marcus for 2 years now, a gift from a veterans organization that specialized in training service animals for wounded warriors. Their bond had been forged through countless hours of training, late-night episodes where Ranger's calming presence had prevented Marcus from spiraling into darkness, and quiet moments where the dog seemed to understand his human's pain better than any person ever could. The store was relatively quiet that morning, with only a handful of customers browsing the aisles. An elderly man was examining packages of bacon near the deli counter, while a young mother pushed her cart through the cereal aisle, her toddler babbling happily in the seat. The peaceful atmosphere was exactly what Marcus needed, a stark contrast to the chaos and noise that often triggered his memories of roadside bombs and fallen comrades. As Marcus made his way toward the checkout counter, he noticed a police cruiser pulling into the parking lot through the large front windows. Officer David Reynolds stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt and straightening his uniform. Reynolds was relatively new to the force, having graduated from the police academy just 8 months earlier. He was eager to prove himself and had developed a reputation for being somewhat aggressive in his approach to law enforcement, often viewing situations through a lens of suspicion rather than understanding. The bell above the door chimed as Officer Reynolds entered the store. His eyes immediately scanned the interior, a habit drilled into him during training. When his gaze fell upon Marcus and Ranger, something shifted in his demeanor. Perhaps it was the dog's presence that triggered his concern, or maybe it was his unfamiliarity with service animal regulations, but Reynolds began walking purposefully toward the veteran. Marcus was reaching for his wallet when he noticed the officer approaching. He had dealt with law enforcement before regarding Ranger's access rights, and while most officers were respectful once they understood the situation, there were occasionally those who seemed determined to create problems. Something in Reynolds's stride and the set of his jaw suggested this might be one of those difficult encounters. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Reynolds said, his voice carrying an authoritative tone that immediately drew the attention of other customers in the store. "I need to speak with you about your dog." Marcus turned slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Ranger sensed the shift in tension and moved slightly closer to his handler's left leg, ready to provide support if needed. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the familiar tightness beginning to form in his chest. "Dogs aren't allowed in food establishments," Reynolds stated, pulling out his citation book with a flourish that seemed designed more for show than necessity. "I'm going to need you to remove the animal from the premises immediately." Mrs. Patterson looked up from her register, her face creased with concern. She had witnessed this exact scenario play out in other businesses and knew that Marcus and Ranger had every legal right to be in the store. However, she also recognized the aggressive posture of the young officer and felt uncertain about how to intervene without making the situation worse. "Officer, this is my service dog," Marcus explained patiently, gesturing toward Ranger's clearly marked vest. "He's trained to assist with my disability and is legally permitted to accompany me in all public places, including restaurants and stores." Reynolds barely glanced at the vest before shaking his head dismissively. "I don't care what kind of vest he's wearing. Anyone can buy those online these days. I've dealt with plenty of people trying to pass off their pets as service animals just so they can bring them wherever they want." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. After everything he had sacrificed for his country, after losing part of his leg and carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal, to have his legitimate need for assistance questioned by someone who was supposed to serve and protect felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. "Sir, I can provide documentation of my disability and Ranger's training," Marcus offered, reaching slowly toward his wallet to avoid any sudden movements that might escalate the situation. "I'm a disabled veteran, and this dog performs specific tasks related to my service-connected injuries." But Officer Reynolds was already committed to his course of action. Perhaps he felt he needed to assert his authority, or maybe he genuinely believed he was enforcing a legitimate law. Whatever his motivation, he seemed determined to pursue the matter regardless of any evidence Marcus might provide. "I don't want to see any fake papers," Reynolds said, his voice growing louder and attracting even more attention from other customers. "What I want is for you to take your pet and leave this store right now, or I'll have to cite you for violating health department regulations." The situation was becoming increasingly surreal for Marcus. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, had survived an improvised explosive device that nearly cost him his life, and had endured months of painful rehabilitation. Yet here he was, in a small-town grocery store, being threatened with a citation for the crime of shopping while disabled. Ranger remained perfectly calm throughout the exchange, his training evident in every aspect of his behavior. The dog showed no signs of aggression or fear, instead maintaining his focus on Marcus and preparing to respond if his handler's stress levels continued to rise. This was exactly the kind of professional demeanor that distinguished genuine service animals from pets, but Officer Reynolds seemed either unwilling or unable to recognize the difference. "Officer Reynolds," Mrs. Patterson finally spoke up from behind the counter, her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen this gentleman and his dog in here many times before. They've never caused any problems, and I believe the dog is legitimate." Reynolds turned toward the elderly clerk with visible irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but I'm trained to recognize these situations. This is clearly someone trying to abuse the system, and I won't stand by while it happens in my jurisdiction." The irony of the statement was lost on no one except the officer himself. Here was a man who had genuinely served his country, whose injuries were real and whose need for assistance was legitimate, being accused of abusing a system designed to help people exactly like him. Marcus felt his heart rate beginning to increase, the familiar signs of an approaching panic attack starting to manifest. Ranger immediately detected the change in his handler's physiological state and began performing his trained response, moving to position himself where Marcus could feel the dog's solid presence against his leg. This movement, perfectly normal and necessary for Marcus's well-being, seemed to further agitate Officer Reynolds. "Now the dog is acting aggressively," he declared, his hand moving instinctively toward his utility belt. "Sir, you need to control your animal immediately." The absurdity of calling Ranger's therapeutic behavior aggressive would have been laughable if the situation weren't becoming so serious. Marcus realized that he was dealing with someone who either had no understanding of service animal behavior or was determined to create a problem regardless of the facts. "Officer, my dog is performing his trained task," Marcus explained, his voice remaining calm despite the storm building inside him. "He's responding to my medical condition, which is exactly what he's supposed to do." But Reynolds was beyond listening to reason. In his mind, he had identified a problem and was going to solve it, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. The power dynamic of the situation seemed to be feeding his determination to assert control. "I'm giving you one final warning," Reynolds announced loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear clearly. Remove the dog from the premises immediately, or I will be forced to take action. At that moment, something inside Marcus shifted. He had been patient, respectful, and accommodating. He had offered documentation, explained the law, and remained calm in the face of ignorance and hostility. But there was a line that could not be crossed, and Officer Reynolds was about to step over it in a way that would change everything. Hashtag A Veteran's Story, Continuation. What happened next would be replayed in Marcus's mind for weeks afterward. Officer Reynolds, apparently frustrated by what he perceived as non-compliance, took a step forward and reached toward Ranger. Perhaps his intention was simply to grab the dog's collar and remove him from the store, or maybe he planned to check for identification tags. Whatever his goal, the moment his hand made contact with Ranger's head in a rough, grabbing motion, everything changed. Ranger yelped sharply, more from surprise than pain, but the sound cut through the store like a gunshot. The dog stumbled slightly as Reynolds gripped his collar with unnecessary force, trying to pull him away from Marcus. For a service animal trained to remain calm in virtually any situation, this sudden physical assault from a stranger was both shocking and terrifying. Marcus watched in horror as the officer's rough handling caused his faithful companion to whimper and struggle slightly against the inappropriate contact. Ranger had been trained never to bite or show aggression, even when threatened, which made him completely vulnerable to someone who chose to harm him. The dog looked up at Marcus with confused, frightened eyes, unable to understand why this stranger was hurting him when he had done nothing wrong. The sight of his service dog being manhandled by someone in uniform triggered something primal in Marcus. This wasn't just an attack on his companion, it was an assault on his independence, his dignity, and his ability to function in the world. Ranger represented hope, healing, and the possibility of a normal life after trauma. Watching someone abuse that symbol of recovery felt like watching his future being torn away. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly from behind the counter, her hand flying to her mouth as she witnessed the officer's inappropriate actions. The other customers in the store had stopped what they were doing and were staring at the scene unfolding before them. Several people had pulled out their cell phones, some calling 911 while others began recording video of the incident. "Officer, please stop," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "You're hurting my dog." But Reynolds seemed to have crossed a line from which there was no return. Perhaps the adrenaline of the confrontation had affected his judgment, or maybe he felt he needed to follow through with his actions to maintain authority. Whatever the reason, he continued to grip Ranger's collar while reaching for his radio with his free hand. "I'm calling animal control," Reynolds announced. "This animal is clearly not trained properly if it can't handle basic handling by law enforcement." The statement was so divorced from reality that Marcus felt as though he had entered some kind of nightmare. Ranger's reaction was perfectly normal for any animal being roughly grabbed by a stranger, and his restraint in not biting or fighting back actually demonstrated the excellence of his training. A pet would likely have snapped or tried to escape, but Ranger's service training kept him from retaliating even when frightened and confused. Marcus could feel his own training kicking in, the military discipline that had kept him alive in combat situations. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and the enemy wasn't a foreign insurgent. This was a small-town grocery store, and the person threatening his well-being was wearing the uniform of his own country's law enforcement. "Sir, I'm asking you one more time to release my dog," Marcus said, his voice now carrying a tone that hadn't been there before. It was the voice of someone who had commanded troops in battle, who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure, and who would not be intimidated by someone abusing their authority. Reynolds apparently heard the change in tone and decided to escalate further. Still gripping Ranger's collar, he used his free hand to reach for his pepper spray. "Are you threatening a police officer?" he demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Everyone in the store could see that Marcus had made no threatening gestures, had not raised his voice until asked to do so, and had conducted himself with remarkable restraint throughout the entire encounter. The only aggression being displayed was coming from Officer Reynolds himself. Marcus stood perfectly still, his military bearing evident in his posture and the controlled way he held himself. Ranger continued to look between his handler and the officer, clearly distressed but still trying to perform his duties despite the rough treatment he was receiving. That was when Marcus spoke the two words that would echo through the store, the community, and eventually the nation. Two words that carried the weight of his service, his sacrifice, and his absolute refusal to be bullied by someone who had clearly forgotten what it meant to serve others. Stop. Now. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried more authority than all of Officer Reynolds's shouting and posturing combined. They were the words of someone who had earned the right to speak them, who had paid a price that gave him moral standing that no badge or uniform could confer. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Reynolds's hand froze on his pepper spray, apparently recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between them. Mrs. Patterson stopped breathing entirely, sensing that she was witnessing something significant. The other customers felt the electricity in the air, the moment when absolute conviction meets absolute authority and exposes which one is real. Marcus took one small step forward, not in a threatening manner, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real enemies and real danger. His eyes never left Officer Reynolds's face as he spoke again, his voice still controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. "You are going to release my service dog immediately," Marcus said, each word carefully measured and precisely delivered. "You are going to step back and allow me to complete my shopping. And then you are going to think very carefully about whether this is the kind of police officer you want to be." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the store seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve. Ranger remained perfectly still, his training overriding his natural instinct to flee from the hostile situation. Officer Reynolds found himself in a position he had not anticipated. The quiet authority in Marcus's voice, combined with the growing awareness that multiple people were recording the encounter, began to penetrate his earlier certainty. For the first time since entering the store, he seemed to actually look at Marcus rather than simply seeing him as an obstacle to overcome. What he saw was a man standing with perfect military bearing despite his prosthetic leg, wearing a baseball cap with veteran insignia, and displaying the kind of calm confidence that only comes from having faced genuine life-threatening situations. This wasn't some random citizen trying to scam the system with a fake service animal. This was someone who had clearly served his country and earned his benefits through sacrifice. The realization seemed to hit Reynolds like a physical blow. His grip on Ranger's collar loosened slightly as doubt began to creep into his mind. He had entered the store so certain of his authority and his interpretation of the situation, but now that certainty was crumbling in the face of Marcus's unwavering composure. Mrs. Patterson found her voice in the tense silence. "Officer," she said softly, "this gentleman is a regular customer. He lost his leg serving our country, and his dog helps him with his disability. Please let them be." The additional context seemed to complete the picture for Reynolds. He was no longer looking at a random customer with a questionable service animal, but at a disabled veteran whose rights he had just violated in the most public way possible. The weight of his mistake began to settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Slowly, reluctantly, Officer Reynolds released his grip on Ranger's collar. The dog immediately moved back to Marcus's side, pressing against his handler's leg in the comforting way he had been trained to do. The relief on Ranger's face was visible to everyone watching, and several customers could be heard sighing with relief. Marcus reached down to gently stroke Ranger's head, checking to make sure his companion hadn't been injured during the rough handling. The dog's tail wagged slightly at his handler's touch, but he remained alert and focused on his duties. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, his voice returning to its earlier calm tone. The two words carried no sarcasm or hostility, just the acknowledgement of a right action finally taken. Officer Reynolds stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling with how to proceed. His initial certainty had been replaced by the growing awareness that he had made a serious error in judgment. The store full of witnesses, the recording cell phones, and the quiet dignity of the man he had just confronted all combined to create a situation from which there was no graceful exit. Without another word, Reynolds turned and walked quickly toward the store's exit. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by the hurried step of someone eager to escape an uncomfortable situation. The bell above the door chimed his departure, and everyone in the store seemed to exhale collectively. Marcus completed his purchase with Mrs. Patterson, who refused to accept payment for his coffee as a small gesture of support. Other customers approached him to express their outrage at what they had witnessed and their admiration for how he had handled the situation. Several people asked for permission to share the videos they had recorded, wanting to ensure that Officer Reynolds's behavior would not go unnoticed by his superiors. Within hours, the videos began circulating on social media. The story of a disabled veteran being harassed in a grocery store while shopping with his service dog struck a nerve with people across the country. The contrast between Marcus's dignity and Reynolds's aggression was stark and compelling, making the videos go viral within days. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing Marcus about his experience and using the incident to educate viewers about service animal rights and veteran issues. The police department launched an investigation into Officer Reynolds's conduct, eventually leading to his suspension and mandatory retraining on disability rights and de-escalation techniques. For Marcus, the incident became a turning point in his healing journey. Standing up for himself and Ranger had reminded him of his own strength and worth, qualities that had been damaged by his combat experiences but not destroyed. The support he received from the community helped restore his faith in the goodness of people and the possibility that his service had not been in vain. Ranger, resilient as always, showed no lasting effects from the encounter. Within minutes of leaving the store, he was back to his normal, alert self, ready to provide whatever support Marcus might need. The bond between them, if anything, had been strengthened by successfully navigating the crisis together. The story became a powerful reminder that true authority comes not from a badge or a uniform, but from integrity, courage, and the moral standing that comes from genuine service to others. Marcus's 2 quiet words had spoken louder than all of Officer Reynolds's shouting, proving that sometimes the most powerful responses are also the most measured ones. In the days that followed, Marcus received hundreds of letters and emails from veterans, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by his story. Many shared their own experiences with disability discrimination or praised him for handling the situation with such grace under pressure. The incident also sparked broader conversations about the treatment of veterans, the rights of people with disabilities, and the proper training of law enforcement officers. It became a teaching moment that reached far beyond the confines of Murphy's General Store, touching lives and changing perspectives across the nation. For Marcus Thompson and Ranger, however, life gradually returned to its routine. They continued their Tuesday morning trips to the store, where they were always welcomed warmly by Mrs. Patterson and treated with the respect they had always deserved. The victory had been quiet but complete, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with dignity, courage, and 2 perfectly chosen words.